Hi, I'm Peggy Monaghan and I'm a volunteer at the Kiltartan Gregory Museum in Gort, County Galway. We're very grateful to Sister Lourdes Fahy, one of the founding members of the museum, for recording the lecture you're about to watch, Lady Gregory's Diaspora. Sister Lourdes first gave this lecture in September 2011 at the time of the Ireland Reaching Out project. In it, she references Lady Gregory's journals and talks about the diaspora who left Coole and Kiltartan in the early 19th century. We thought it would be nice to do this year because it's celebrating the 25th anniversary of the museum, which was founded in August 1996. So we hope you really enjoy it.
On the 24th of September 1911, Lady Gregory was in mid-Atlantic on board the ship Kimrick on the first of her 4 voyages to the USA. The Abbey Players had sailed some days previously. She wrote, "I said goodbye to home, where I had meant to spend a quiet winter, writing and planting trees, and to the little granddaughter for whose first appearance in the world I had waited." This was Anne Gregory de Winton, who was 1 week old when Lady Gregory set out. Much has been written about the American tours of the Abbey Players. Some of their production produced not a little controversy, especially Synge's Playboy of the Western World. Strong opposition came from the newspaper The Irish American and from various Irish American Catholic organisations. Shortly before the tour, W.B. Yeats stated that it had always been the Abbey's view that the company could not claim to be truly a national company unless it played before the Irish diaspora as well as the Irish at home. However, Lady Gregory was welcomed on a personal level by many of the children of her tenants, to use her own words, comfortably settled in their new own homes. She wrote home to Robert, "T.C. and his wife came to the theatre and brought me a beautiful bouquet of pink carnations. I had a visit from M.R., such a handsome, smart girl, from N.H., which I think is Newhall, sending up her visiting card, very pleased with herself." By and large, Lady Gregory paints a somewhat rosy picture of the emigrants' lives. Some Connacht girls who had met her in Buffalo said, "Since we were the height of the table, America, it was always our dream." Indeed, there are many success stories, not achieved without struggle. Over and over again, we read of the triumph of the human spirit over adversity. Education was the key that unlocked the door to success, and Irish nuns played a big part in this. The emigrants sent money home to bring out other family members. The historian Arnold Schreer calculated that during the latter part of the 19th century, the Irish in America sent over $260 million back to Ireland. Lady Gregory stated that the people at home felt nearer to America than to England. At one time, she asked an old woman at Kiltartan why her daughter, who had been home on a visit, had left her again. And she said, her teeth were troubling her and her dentist lives in Boston. On another occasion, as Lady Gregory was passing a roofless long deserted cottage near Kiltartan, a woman told her that a few years previously a well-to-do man had come from America, son or grandson of the last who had lived there. He had taken 2 stones from the wall back to America. Writing in the magazine Brooklyn Citizen in 1912, Lady Gregory concluded, "It has always been so. That little Ireland has held the hearts of people through the ages." Now, Lady Gregory wasn't the only one who met the diaspora. Her husband, Sir William Gregory, had done so some years before. Let's go back in time to the visit of William Gregory to America in the mid-1850s. That is over half a century before 1911, Lady Gregory's first trip. At the time, back in Ireland in the 1850s, he was known to many as Quarter Acre Gregory. It's something forgotten that in the Poor Relief Bill, he wanted smallholders to be induced to give up their land and leave Ireland with an offer of assistance to emigrate and settle in the colonies. The landlords would bear 2/3 of the expenses, and the boards of guardians of the workhouses would pay the remaining third. In fact, Gregory was highly critical of Comerford, the purchaser of the Kinvara portion of the Gregory estates in the late 1850s. He said, "He killed the goose for the golden egg." The town of Kinvara was all but ruined. The best tenants ran away. I met one in Australia at Ballarat, and he assured me he was well off when I was his landlord, but a pauper 3 years later when he emigrated. We associate the Irish diaspora with New York, Boston, and cities on the east side. But William Gregory found them further west. He records that one evening at Louisville, Kentucky, a man rushed from his wagon and horses and embraced him, saying, "Oh, my dear master, don't you remember me?" He continues, "I had not forgotten him. He was a tenant's son and had crossed the Atlantic to seek his fortune some years previously. He told me the wagon and horses were his own, and that he was running, though quite a young man, into much money. The next day he brought a concourse of former inhabitants of my property and of the vicinity, and we had a long and pleasant chat on home matters and on their own prospects in America, which were certainly very encouraging." It's tempting to surmise that some of the relatives of the Noons of Corker were among that group. Most Irish emigrants were young, single, and unskilled. The Noons were young, single, and certainly not unskilled when they reached Louisville. From the 1850s, Michael, Thomas, Peter, and William Noon worked in various secretarial occupations for some of the leading firms in Louisville. Their eldest brother John stayed on the family farm. He cooperated with Lady Gregory and with Sir Horace Plunkett in setting up a branch of the IAOS in Coole. The Irish Homestead, which was the journal of the IAOS, described John Noon as an able, practical farmer and a man who has always taken an active interest in the public affairs of the parish and country. John Noon was elected secretary of the Kiltartan Gaelic League in January 1899. It was one of the first branches of the League in rural Ireland. His mother told Lady Gregory that she was anxious for him to get married, but that he was too fond of the books. Eventually he married in 1900. When he died without issue in 1918, his brother Martin, an electrical engineer who had emigrated in 1902, returned from Kentucky and took over the farm. He was the father of the late Dr. Francis Noon, the esteemed treasurer of the Kiltartan Gregory Cultural Society. Dr. Francis had also been one of the diaspora, having spent most of his professional life in the USA. As was fitting to a member of such a cultured family, he bequeathed a large sum of money to Gort Community School for the advancement of education. In Cincinnati, Ohio, Gregory discovered that the porter of the hotel had married a daughter of one of his tenants, a certain Mrs. Regan of Lusitania. He invited him to visit his wife that evening. She had been on the staff in Coole. He quotes, "A very good-looking and remarkably clever girl. I found her in snug rooms, well furnished, and full of friends from Gort and the region thereabout. Nothing could be more pleasant than the evening which, with the help of tea, and I am afraid not a little whisky punch, was prolonged to a late hour. The whole assembly accompanied me to the hotel, and at parting, my hostess whispered something to her husband, who, with a smile, said to me, 'I hope your honour won't be offended with the request, but my wife wished your honour will, for the sake of old times, give her a kiss at parting.' I willingly acceded and gave the asked for accolade, and the party broke up with a cheer to celebrate it." The Regan family figure prominently in Lady Gregory's journals. Patsy Regan, a nephew of the girl in Cincinnati, was one of the chief negotiators in the sale of the Coole domain lands. The family also bought Ballynamanton in 1920. Two of Patsy's sons emigrated to Australia. Lady Gregory notes in 1928, "Met a young fellow, a Regan, looked sad, and told me he was setting out for Melbourne, Australia. His brother, who went 2 years ago, has found work there and married, and sent for him. They are a well-to-do family, some of whom are now living in Ballynamanton. But there seems to be little to do for these well-off families. They are above the class of day labourers." During our recent research for the Ireland Reaching Out project, we found the name and address of a daughter of one of these brothers, and she is still in contact with those living in the old home in Lusitania. Kolbek and the Irish diaspora. Now, Kolbek is the village beside the Coole domain, and a lot of the people who worked on the Gregory estate lived in Kolbek. The Gregory family would have known the people who lived in Kolbek quite well. Members of those families form part of the diaspora. O'Loughlin. John O'Loughlin, born in 1854, a younger brother of Murty, who was a trusted member of the Coole staff, emigrated to Queensland, Australia in 1879. The previous year saw William Gregory, who was still very much in favour of assisted emigration, and who certainly would have been acquainted with John O'Loughlin, wrote, "Practically any man of good character may go to Queensland and New Zealand on application to the emigration agents for the colonies there." We were often told that the O'Loughlins of Kolbek were distant relatives of Sir Coleman O'Loughlin, MP for County Clare, who was a good friend of Sir William Gregory. John's wife, Johanna Ryan, died young in Australia and left him with 5 children under 6 years of age. He wasn't able to care for them, and they were scattered to various foster homes. John went abroad as a ship's carpenter and only came back to Australia when the children were adults. Sadly, he took his own life in Lithgow in 1918 at the age of 64. His great-grandson Paul Robinson, who lives in Armidale, New South Wales, got in contact with me last year. He has been invited back to our week of welcomes. And since I wrote this, Paul has come back to see Kolbek. In the next generation, 6 of Morty's 10 children emigrated to New York between the years 1900 and 1920, and the youngest went to England. The second girl was born in 1882 and was named Isabella, possibly after Lady Gregory, or could it be Isabella Nimmo, who was nicknamed Jack the Sailor, who gave her name to the Isabella Wood, which was situated at the back of O'Loughlin's house. The wood is better known as Pork na Lee. The Farrell family. Lady Gregory often mentions old Farrell, the nurseryman. His son Bill emigrated first in 1907 to Roxbury, Massachusetts. He returned on holidays and went back again to the USA in September 1924. Lady Gregory says in her journals that he cried when he said goodbye to John Rourke. Incidentally, it is said that Bill Farrell put the first initials, W.F., on the autograph tree in Coole. He gave the knife to Lawrence Dooley of the Gate Lodge to do the same, but Lar was afraid he would lose his job. A grandniece of Bill Farrell, who lives in Sutton, Dublin, says that Bill returned eventually to Ireland, went to Belfast and had a little shop there. This lady would love to see the staff of Coole commemorated in Coole, and by the erection of a plaque or some form of recognition. And I say amen to that. The Dooley family. Nora Dooley from the Gate Lodge worked in Coole House. She emigrated to New York with John Quinn of Corker in 1910, and they married there on arrival. The Quinns had 6 daughters and 2 sons. One of the daughters only died in 2014. They worked in the secretarial department of Macy's in Fifth Avenue and were well known as the Quinn Girls of Macy's. Their children are still in contact with Kiltartan and with their relatives in Gort. Just 3 years after Nora's arrival in New York, who should arrive on her doorstep but her old workmate in Coole House, Marion McGuinness. Yes, the same Marion who later tried to put the fear of God into Sean O'Casey when he arrived without a collar and tie. It's quite possible that Lady Gregory met Jack and Nora Quinn during one of the USA tours. The Abbey Players returned for their second visit or tour on the 1st of May 1913. Marion arrived at number 438 West 49th Street on the 16th of May. I'd love to have been a fly on the wall then. Marion seems to have been very close to the Dooleys. When she got a stroke in 1928, Nora's sister, Mary Ann, who had married a Michael Cosgrave of Ballinderreen, took in Marion and cared for her until Marion died there a few years later. The Herr family. The Herrs came to Coole to live in Farrell's house when that family left in 1907. Bridget Herr was one of the first of the locals to emigrate to England and to train as a nurse. Sadly, she died in 1927, aged 20. Her sister Mary Ann also went to England. Mary Ann's grandson Andrew Clay now owns the old homestead. The Fleming family. The only children in the oldest national school, Kiltartan roll book, were not listed as Roman Catholics. They were Jessie, Eliza, and Anne Fleming. Their EC was written after their names, Established Church. Their mother, Janet Glass Fleming, died when the children were very young. She is buried in Gort Cemetery beside the library. Her husband William remarried but died a few years later. In 1892, Lady Gregory recorded in her journals, "I hear that the Fleming children are destitute." The family moved back to Scotland, from where they came originally. We had a surprise visit to the museum a few years ago when Jessie Fleming's daughter, Margaret Millen, came from Edinburgh. Nobody had ever heard of the Flemings, but out came the old roll book. She was very moved when she saw her granny's name. I directed her to Gort Cemetery. Further references to Coole and the diaspora. The name of Michael Corley of Ballyaneen appears on the list of workers who congratulated Robert Gregory on the occasion of his 21st birthday in 1902. 8 years later, he emigrated to Massachusetts. His son visited the museum in 1996, and his great-granddaughter, Meredith Corley, studied at NUIG for the Christmas-Easter semester 10 years ago. A cousin of his, Anne Corley, worked as a parlour maid in Coole before emigrating to New Zealand around 1910. Another family, Jack Hallinan of Ballynamanton, was one of the chief negotiators in the sale of the Coole estate in 1920. He enlisted the help of Lady Gregory for his daughter's hospital training in Plymouth. Rourke. Lady Gregory gave clothes to Mary Rourke to emigrate in 1895. Perhaps this was the Mary Orr from Kiltartan, who came to see the Abbey's plays in Boston. And then there was little Fanny Riley, to whom Lady Gregory gave a communion dress in 1900. After her father's death, she and her mother emigrated to faraway Deer Creek, Oklahoma in 1908. When one of the anti-treaty locals emigrated to Canada in 1924, Lady Gregory remarked, "He was the first of our Kiltartan people I have heard of going there. Some have been disappointed about the USA. The numbers are filled," referring to the quota on the number of immigrants in the 1920s. Ireland reaching out, 1911. The wheel has come full circle. A few years ago, an important meeting was held in Farmleigh, Dublin. Successful members of the Irish diaspora gave their opinions as to how best reignite the Irish economy. When David McWilliams, the celebrity economist, who was chairman of the meeting, was asked what project could best be used at local level, he had no hesitation in naming the one called Ireland Reaching Out. It was the brainchild of Mike Feerick, an IT entrepreneur who was born in the USA but grew up in southeast Galway. Basically, Ireland Reaching Out amounts to this. Instead of waiting for Irish emigrants or their descendants, the diaspora, to come to Ireland, why not invite them back? McWilliams cited the case of Israel. Israeli programs invite young Americans of Jewish heritage to come to Israel to learn more about who they are and how the state of Israel can be part of their lives. The Israelis seem to have a forensic knowledge of who was who and where everyone was. Ireland has the same resource here in every village, just waiting to be tapped. But as Tim Pat Coogan pointed out in his book, Wherever Green is Worn, neither amongst the Irish Americans nor the Irish government was there any vision of building a relationship even remotely resembling that of the Jews with Israel. The Irish Americans were working hard, and there wasn't much time for ethnic concerns beyond the annual St. Patrick's Day celebrations. But ladies and gentlemen, that is already changing. The Ireland Reaching Out project has the potential to transform genealogy as we know it, and more importantly, it could change the relationship between Ireland and the Irish diaspora. The missing element of genealogical research, the local meet and greet, which Irish people do so well, can transform tourism to local parishes the length and breadth of Ireland. Using the latest online communication and database tools and resources, we could reunify our entire diaspora, expanding each local parish beyond its own physical boundaries. The vast majority of the Irish diaspora, numbering between 60 and 70 million, have never set foot in Ireland, but they want to be connected with the place. Southeast Galway, which includes this district here, was selected as a pilot area for Ireland Reaching Out. We sent out forms by surface mail and by email. Communities in other parts of Ireland have shown a keen interest and would like to replicate it in their own areas. To give some examples, Cameo Wood. A young lady from California received an invitation. She never realised that she had Irish roots. She discovered that her great-great-great-grandparents were Patrick and Margaret Ball. They are buried in Killarney Cemetery. Her great-grandfather was a gardener here in Coole. Another, just last March, I had a visit from a descendant of one of the orphan girls who was sent out to Australia from the Gort workhouse. Then there was young Catherine Horn, aged 14, who went missing in America. I often wondered what could have happened to her. The riddle was solved for me about 2 years ago when her great-grandnephew, Donald Fryery, contacted us from Massachusetts to say that Catherine was reunited with her mother through a message put on the Boston Pilot newspaper in 1859. A Winifred Noon left this parish in 1899 and married an Austrian in America. After doing some research for her grandson, he wrote back to me, "You probably thought you'd never make a 6'8" man cry, but you did." While researching for my book on the history of Kiltartan, the name of the book is Many Leaves, One Root, I came across the name Garrett Egan a few times. He farmed land in the glebe of Kiltartan, which was owned by the Church of Ireland, in 1839. He was a member of the Kiltartan Relief Committee in 1846, at the start of the famine, and he got contracts for relief works the same year. He then disappeared from history. About 3 years ago, we got a letter from Edward and Marge O'Connor. Garrett Egan happened to have been Marge's great-great-grandfather. He had emigrated with his family in 1849 and gone to Deerfield, Massachusetts. Mystery solved. He would have been well known to Robert Gregory, the father of Sir William, who had died a victim of famine fever in 1847 while looking after his tenants. Edward and Marge came to our week of welcomes last June. In fact, they were the first people who applied to come to the week of welcomes. They touched the wall around the Kiltartan cemetery, which had been constructed under the supervision of Garrett Egan during the famine. They saw the fields which he farmed, and they travelled the Castletown Road, where he cut down hills and raised hollows. Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence I have given covers the years from the 1840s, when Robert Gregory was a landlord here, through the 45 years of his son William's tenure, on to the stirring times of Sir William's widow, Lady Gregory, and the all too short era of her son Robert. It is a work in progress. Talk given at the autumn gathering, Coole Park, 24th of September 2011 by Sister Lourdes Fahy, whose ancestors were tenants of the Gregorys. Every Irish emigrant can be sure of getting a céad míle fáilte, 100,000 welcomes in Ireland. Unfortunately, COVID, which has visited us for the last year and a half, has changed a lot, and we certainly will miss the Irish diaspora for the next while. We don't know how long. Ach ba fáilte agus fithe romh go léir, go mo fada bún sibh.